This story of John Nevins Andrews means something special to Chad and Brennan Kirstein. You boys are interested in this Hall of Faith story because Elder Andrews is your great-great-great-grandfather. That goes a long ways back.
This is another picture of Edward Andrews.
But your grandmother's scrapbook is filled with mementos, letters, and pictures that show us interesting things about the early beginnings of our church. The Andrews had a son, Charles, and a daughter, Mary. Charles was 17 and his sister only 13 when they left Boston Harbor as the first overseas Seventh-day Adventist missionaries. And this is a picture of the house in Basel, Switzerland, where they lived. John Nevins Andrews. He was born in Poland, Maine, and he grew up in this little community of Paris. As a boy, John undoubtedly tramped all over this countryside. It was here that he learned to love books. John was a good student, but at the age of 11, he became ill and had to quit school. His father brought him books, and on his own, he learned to read Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. This was a time when a great religious movement was sweeping across the country. A farmer-turned-preacher was preaching that Jesus was about to return to earth. His name was William Miller, and he drew great crowds. John's family was attracted to the Second Coming message and joined the Millerite movement. We don't know exactly where the Andrews lived, or even if the house is still standing, but it must have been fairly large, for the Andrews shared their house with another family who was also looking for Christ's return. They had a 15-year-old daughter who found a paper about the seventh-day Sabbath. She shared it with her brother, and then they took it to John. John studied it, and then told them, "I think the seventh day is a Sabbath, and if you think it's so, then we must keep it." The three teenagers took the paper and their conviction to their parents, and both families became Sabbath keepers. John's uncle was a congressman who recognized John as bright and promising. The uncle offered to send him to Harvard University and groom him for Congress. But Miller's preaching and the little Sabbath pamphlet had sealed in John's mind a determination to preach. He had a message. John and two friends formed a publishing committee to support James White. They joined forces and began printing the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald. The venture was begun in this very house in Paris, Maine. It was 1850. That same year, at the age of 21, John became a traveling preacher. He followed lonely wooded trails. At night, he stayed with anyone who would offer a bed. Often he slept in a shed. Sometimes he awakened with his beard frozen stiff. On he went, preaching, praying, reading, and writing, late into the night. 5 years of such conditions took their toll. He collapsed, physically and mentally exhausted. His parents had moved to a farm near Waukon, Iowa. It was his only hope. Perhaps regular meals, exercise, and rest would give him strength. During the years he was in Waukon, he renewed his friendship with Angeline Stevens, whose parents had also moved from Paris. John and Angeline were married. A son, Charles, and a daughter, Mary, were born. John grew stronger, and once again he was compelled to preach through Minnesota, Michigan, Massachusetts, and New York, on and on. Sometimes he was gone for weeks. It was a lonesome time for Angeline. Every spare moment he was reading and studying. Somehow, he found time to write an article for almost every issue of the Review and Herald. He was a member of the group that organized the official church. He was on the committee that selected Seventh-day Adventists as a church name. He was third president of the General Conference. Charles and Mary inherited their father's sense of dedication. They loved books and music. While he was away, they missed him and became very close to their mother. They were living not far from these shores of Lake Ontario when she suffered a stroke. Earnestly they prayed for her recovery, but within a month she died. They buried her near their home in Rochester, New York. John decided to move where he could be close to the library of Harvard University. He felt that now he would take time to study and to write. John and the children had been living in this house in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, just 2 years when the General Conference asked him to go to Europe as a missionary. I can imagine that the three of them knelt and prayed about the challenge. September 15, 1874 was departure day. The little family gathered at Boston Harbor. Charles and Mary bade farewell to their homeland. They were headed for Switzerland. John Andrews chose to settle in Basel, a city on the Rhine River where France, Germany, and Switzerland come together. He intended to publish a paper, a French Signs of the Times, and the French-speaking city of Basel was centrally located with good printers. They rented this house and set up a living area and editorial offices. They had been studying French. Now, mastery of the language was essential. Charles wrote out a simple agreement that they would speak only French. They all signed it. The frame house they lived in has been replaced by this modern bank, but it was on this site the Andrews family set to work. Father wrote articles. Mary was a proofreader. Charles set the type. Then they took the copy to the printer in a wheelbarrow. The print shop was located in this building that is now a McDonald's restaurant. The finished papers had to look exactly right. On one issue, John stopped the press 50 times to get rid of an ink spot. The office of the Swiss Union Conference has bound copies of those first Signs of the Times, an incredible family accomplishment. Mary was only 14, yet she carried the responsibility as copy editor for the French language. Almost the only diversion for the three from Bible study and work was music. They had a pump organ, and they loved to sing. This is the organ. It now belongs to Lena Gerber, who lives in Switzerland. Lena likes to play it and think about the pleasure it must have brought to the Andrews. Basel was a city of commerce and culture, but the Andrews family missed most of it. They struggled to meet the demands of a monthly publication. Often they spent their food money for printing bills and kept the house cold in order to save. Suddenly, John became ill, very ill. Charles called a doctor who examined him and exclaimed, "This man is almost starved to death." Back in Battle Creek, Michigan, church leaders heard about John's illness. They realized the desperate need for money and set out to raise $10,000 for the work in Switzerland. Believers in the homeland also decided to send 3 more workers to help John. In 1878, a request came for John to attend the General Conference session and report on the progress of the work in Europe. They had worked 4 years in poor conditions. John was worried about Mary. She was not well. His friends urged him to take her with him. Upon arrival in America, they headed straight for Battle Creek Sanitarium. John was sure Dr. Kellogg would help Mary. Kellogg knew the Andrews family well. John had helped him raise money to to build the hospital. He examined Mary and found she had tuberculosis. There was no hope for Mary. Mary celebrated her 17th birthday lying in a hospital bed. Her father was at her side continuously for 2 months. On a winter day in 1878, Mary was buried beside her mother. She had been a missionary in every sense of the word. Mary F. Andrews, teenage Adventist pioneer. Back in their Basel home, Charles had been praying. He had suspected the seriousness of Mary's condition, but the news was still a blow. He sat down and wrote to his dad.
My very dear father, the news is just what I have feared for some time past. I know that she will have part in the first resurrection. Dear Father, I do not forget to pray for you in this your time of great distress. How gladly would I write something to comfort you, if I only knew how. I can only point you to the blessed promise made to the overcomer. God bless you abundantly, my dear Father. Your affectionate son, Charlie.
John Andrews returned to Europe. He continued to offer inspiration and leadership to the European people. The value of his leadership and the depth of his scholarly approach to his mission is illustrated by a glimpse at his library preserved in the Adventist Seminary in France.
We have 647 books which belonged to J.N. Andrews, the first missionary to Europe.
Many of Andrews' books are works of the Reformers. The little rented house on Mulloway was cramped for space. John moved to this house and set up headquarters for the Adventist work. The doctor's fears had come to haunt him. He began to suffer greatly from tuberculosis. Much of the time he was so weak, he just sat and looked at the park across the street. But he struggled on, sometimes propping himself up to read or write. About sundown on a Sunday evening in 1883, a group of friends stood around his bed. He fell asleep so peacefully, they never detected the exact moment he died. He lies buried in this cemetery in Basel. The grave marker reads, John Nevins Andrews, founder and editor, The Signs of the Times. Andrews' faith is part of a heritage shared by the family of God that touches nearly every part of the globe. The flagship institution of Adventist education bears his name. The name honors an Adventist author, evangelist, administrator, and missionary, John Nevins Andrews, a man with a message.